Good afternoon. I'm Christina Paxson, and I have the honor of serving as Brown's 19th president as we celebrate a very special event, the university's 250th anniversary. I extend Brown's warmest welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here and being part of our distinctive community of scholars. It is most fitting that we launch this weekend of celebration with an Ogden lecture by Yong Kim, class of 1982. The Ogden lectureship has elevated and enriched discourse at Brown for nearly 50 years, presenting the university and its neighboring communities with authoritative and timely addresses about critical issues in international affairs. The lectureship was established in memory of Stephen A. Ogden, Jr., a member of the Brown class of 1960, who died in 1963 from injuries he had suffered in an auto accident during his junior year. Stephen's family created the Ogden lectureship in 1965 as a tribute to his interest in advancing international peace and understanding. So, as always with every Ogden lecture, I like to extend my gratitude to the Ogden family for their generosity and affirm Stephen's enduring legacy as a vitally important member of the Brown family more than 50 years after his passing. Please join me in recognizing Susan Adler-Kaplan and Dr. Robert Ackerman, who are here today to represent Stephen Ogden's family and closest friends today. And I also just want to send my warm regards to Peg Ogden, who couldn't be with us here today. So, about the Ogden Lecture, dozens of heads of states, diplomats, and observers of the international scene have presented Ogden Lectures over the years, from the former president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, to President of Bolivia, Evo Morales, to Queen Noor of Jordan. Today, we welcome World Bank President and Brown alumnus, Yong Kim, to this distinguished company. Yes. Now, I'd like to say that Brown could take full credit for President Kim's extraordinary achievements, but I don't think we can, as you'll hear when he describes his story. He brings many gifts to his work, just one of which is a Brown education. But it's wonderful to know that his journey carried him through Providence, and to know that Brown informs his service to the world. Jim's values are Brown's values. We're deeply committed to building peaceful, just, and prosperous societies worldwide. We advance that work through the intellectual and humanitarian contributions of our Watson Institute for International Studies, our Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, and the work of hundreds of faculty members and especially our students. Brown people are working all over the world to address issues of poverty, inequality, sustainability, disease, and disability. This ethos of engagement, of using the best of Brown to address the world's challenges, is core to the university's new plan for the future, building on distinction. Similarly, Jim Kim has spent his life serving the world's underserved people. In collaboration with another extraordinary physician humanitarian, Paul Farmer, he co-founded Partners in Health. He served as director of the HIV/AIDS department at the World Health Organization. A former president of Dartmouth College, he's now the 12th president of the World Bank Group, an organization with two interdependent goals: to end extreme poverty in developing nations and to promote shared prosperity by fostering income growth for the lowest earning populations in each country. In 2003, he was awarded a prestigious MacArthur Fellowship for his vision and his leadership. His career provides an excellent model of what can be achieved with innovative thinking and with global partnership. Brown is extremely proud of Jim Kim, so please join me in welcoming him to deliver the 87th Stephen J. Ogden Jr. Class of 60 Memorial Lecture on International Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. What a great pleasure it is indeed to be back here at Brown to celebrate our 250th anniversary. We're all so proud that Brown remains one of the world's leading institutions of higher learning. I'm confident that under President Paxson, Chris, Brown's role will grow further still. She understands that academic institutions have an unshakable responsibility to inspire students as they think about and confront the world's most important problems. The fundamental questions that drove me when I was a student remain the questions that we must ask ourselves today. What is to be done in the world, and what will I do? Every one of us, in one form or another, must address these questions. The enormity of the challenges we face force us to do so. You know, I grew up in Iowa in the 1960s and 1970s. My parents always encouraged me to strive for excellence and impact, but they had very different ways of doing so. Excuse me. My father was a dentist. Dentists, as you probably know, are among the most practical people in the world. He taught me that concrete, practical things are needed in order to succeed in life. And so I remember the day that I came home from Brown for the very first time. My father picked me up at the airport, got in the car, and as we were driving home, the airport was about 30 miles from my hometown of Muscatine, Iowa. He sort of said offhandedly, so what are you thinking of studying? And I had been so turned on by my first semester at Brown that I said, you know, I want to study philosophy and political science, and you know, I think I can make a real difference in the world of politics. So he slowed the car down, pulled over to the side of the road, turned the engine off, and we sat there for a little while. And he finally looked back at me and he said, you know, Jim, after you finish your medical residency, you can do anything you want. Now, the funny thing is, I've actually told this story to an Asian audience and nobody laughs. You see, my father knew something about uncertainty. He grew up in Korea during a gruesome civil war, and he worried that his own children, who grew up in America, would not understand the importance of actually having a skill. My mother took a very different approach. She's a philosopher. She taught me from a very early age to care about social justice, politics, and what was happening around the world. My mother stressed human empathy and the importance of history and culture in shaping economic and political outcomes. She used to say, you have to act with a sense of eternity. And what she meant was that she wanted each of her children to do something that would make a difference in the world. She also introduced me to the American Civil Rights Movement, and in particular to the teachings and speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King. One of my most vivid memories is sitting in our living room watching Dr. King on television. I was moved by many of his words, but especially when he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Inspired by Dr. King, I knew I wanted to bend the arc of history and fight injustice and fight institutionalized discrimination. But my horizons were limited. Most of my friends and teachers were more interested in the upcoming Iowa Hawkeyes game than the race riots of 1968 or the war in Vietnam. I enrolled at the University of Iowa as a freshman, but I couldn't shake my dreams of having a larger impact, being part of a larger world. So then I transferred to Brown my sophomore year, and after that, quite literally, nothing was the same. I found home at the Third World Center, where I quickly learned that I was not the only kid who ever felt like an outsider. Some of my new friends had grown up in really tough situations. Some were from Bedford-Stuyvesant and Harlem, which back in those days were very different places. They had endured racist taunts, they were poor, and their families lived on food stamps. Their mothers worked 2 jobs and had little time to spend at home. Their stories fundamentally shaped me. They gave me a powerful sense of what it meant to struggle in the United States, to choose between meals or medicine, or joining gangs versus becoming a target of gangs. resignation or resistance, all in the richest country in the world. They motivated me to take action. One Parents' Weekend I'll never forget, my friends from the Third World Center and I dressed up in black and marched around campus, protesting the university's decision to raise tuition without increasing financial aid for students who needed it. We won concessions on the issue and eventually led Brown to adopt a need-blind admissions policy. But from that moment on, I was hooked. I realized that activism could drive fundamental social change. What a sense of empowerment. By the time I graduated in 1982, I started thinking beyond the change that we could effect in Providence. I asked myself once again, what is to be done in the world and what will I do? Today, 32 years later, having co-founded Partners in Health, worked at the World Health Organization, Harvard University, and Dartmouth College, and now in my role as president of the World Bank, I can look back with a little more clarity and even propose some answers to those fundamental questions. What is to be done? At the World Bank Group, we've set two goals, as President Paxson mentioned: end extreme poverty by 2030 and boost shared prosperity for the bottom 40% of every developing country. These goals will drive our work going forward, but three major challenges will determine whether we succeed. The first is achieving inclusive economic growth. Today, most countries have turned to the market to accelerate growth and are focused on adopting policies that enable businesses to invest, grow, and create jobs. Indeed, the private sector is now the source of 90% of job creation in developing countries, and very few governments continue to promote an exclusively state-led approach to economic development. The Communist parties of China and Vietnam, for example, are deeply engaged, and we've had many conversations with them about how they can improve their competitiveness in the global capitalist system. Even in Myanmar, a country that was closed off to the world for 60 years, one of the key questions that government officials asked me when I visited in January was, how can we engage the market, attract investment, and create good jobs for our people? But we also learned that growth isn't enough. Economic growth accounts for about 2/3 of poverty reduction. The other third comes from redistributive policies, such as progressive tax systems and a particular program that we have worked very hard with, the conditional cash transfers, that give money to the poorest people and give that money on the condition that they send their kids to school and go to the doctor and improve the health of their whole family. In recent years, we've seen what happens when growth is not inclusive. In places as diverse as Egypt, Turkey, Thailand, and Chile, people have streamed into the streets to demand a greater share of their country's economic growth. That leads to the second challenge, investing in people. Investing in people provides a major boost to economic growth and may also represent the best way to forge social inclusion and reduce inequality over time. Let me give you some of the numbers. The Lancet Commission, a group headed by eminent economists in public health sectors, the person who led this particular study was Larry Summers, found that between the years 2000 and 2011, a full 24% of the economic growth in low and middle income countries resulted from improvements in health. The Commission also found that smart health investments would allow low-income countries to reduce their rates of infectious diseases and maternal and child mortality to the levels of the best-performing middle-income countries by 2035. The human gains from this grand convergence in health outcomes would be enormous. The Commission estimated that it would prevent roughly 4.5 million deaths by 2035 alone. The link between education and economic growth is just as strong. A 2010 study by OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, looked at the link between PISA scores, the Program for International Student Assessment, which track academic achievement across countries, and economic growth. The study found that even small improvements in a country's PISA scores can result in substantial long-term economic gains. In other words, when kids learn more, countries' economies grow faster. But even if countries do everything right on the growth front and invest in their people, it won't matter unless we sustain our planet for future generations. This leads to the third global challenge, slowing the rising tide of climate change. Climate change threatens, you can clap, that's fine. Climate change threatens our existence on this planet. And because people living in extreme poverty are more vulnerable than anyone else, they're going to be the first to feel the brunt of the impact. Just consider what's at stake. A 4 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures would trigger unprecedented heat waves, severe drought, and major floods in many regions. The global sea level would rise by up to 1 meter and could be up to 20% higher in the tropics, where most of the world's poor happen to live. Even a 2-degree rise in global temperatures, which could happen as early as 2030, would result in devastating food shortages in sub-Saharan Africa. Some scientists predict that by 2030, if we do reach 2 degrees Celsius, Bangkok will be underwater. It's fundamentally unjust that those least responsible for raising the Earth's temperature will suffer the gravest consequences from climate change. I've called for global leaders to focus on 5 urgent tasks. We must cut carbon emissions in cities. We must promote climate-smart agriculture, increase investment in renewable energy, set a predictable price for carbon, and end fossil fuel subsidies. Some of these steps, of course, will prove extremely challenging politically. Businesses don't want to pay more for energy and don't want fuel prices to rise. But now, and especially this year, is a time for political leaders to show courage and do what it takes to keep our planet livable for future generations. Now, I know that Brown has had its own debate about how to take bold steps to fight climate change. I know, for instance, about the drive to divest all coal investments, and I've read President Paxson's thoughtful response in deciding against doing that. I'm not here to make any judgments on this issue, but I must say that I am so proud as an alumnus that students raise these difficult questions. And I'm even prouder of the way that the whole community and President Paxson has taken them on. Whether it's climate change or ending poverty, maybe you have your own ideas about what needs to be done in the world and how you'll go about doing it. You may disagree with me, and you may challenge my ideas about what needs to be done. That's exactly the kind of bold thinking from young people that keeps the world moving forward. What I want you to remember is how you feel at this very moment in your lives. Idealistic, passionate, driven, wanting to change the world. You not only need to hold on to that, you need to act. When Dr. King talked about bending the arc of history, he didn't mean that we should be spectators who stand by and watch history unfold. He showed us through his own life that all of us must do our part to grab the arc of history and bend it toward justice with everything we have. That's not all. Dr. King also talked about the value of time. In Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail that was here in this wonderful book that I keep going back to over my life called Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King talked about a letter that he received from a white moderate. And the white moderate said to Dr. King, "All Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually, but it is possible that you are in too great a religious hurry. It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth." Dr. King responded, and I quote, "Such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time, from the strangely irrational notion that there's something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right." End quote. When I was your age, I had so many questions about my identity and my purpose. I'm now in the 6th decade of my life, and today I can assure you that the time is always ripe to do right. So find something that will give you clarity and purpose. Find your Dr. King, and then act with urgency and discipline to make a difference in the world. I was a student on this campus, and it feels like it wasn't so long ago. And I had a tight circle of friends. Like many of you today, we asked many questions about ourselves, about justice, and about our place far outside the walls of Brown. Eventually, many of us came to that same fundamental question: what is to be done in the world, and what will I do to change it? That's the question that I've tried to answer my entire life, and I'm still trying. You should ask it of yourselves, too. What will you do? Now, my great hope is that some of you will answer it by working to end poverty, to boost shared prosperity, and to battle climate change. But whatever you do, please remember that the time is now for all of us to work together to bend the arc of history toward justice. The great anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Be those citizens, take it on, and please go change the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. Now, I know that many people here have questions for Dr. Kim, and so I'm going to lead off with, I think, just one question, and then I'm going to open the floor. There are microphones on both sides. I loved your personal story about your father. And your father said, after you finish your medical residency, you can do anything. But I don't think you waited that long. I don't think you followed his advice, because unless my dates are wrong, you founded Partners in Health before you finished your medical residency, before you did a PhD in anthropology. You were quite young. And you've told students here to be bold. But what gave you the self-confidence, the courage to do something as audacious as starting to do work on HIV in Haiti?
Well, thanks. Again, thank you all. Can you hear? Yeah. We're okay? Yeah. So let me tell you, for my father, the story gets even worse than that, because when I was here at Brown, I was really involved in the Asian American Students Association, the Third World Center, and I was admitted to several medical schools, but the one I really wanted to go to was the University of California at San Francisco, because San Francisco is where the Asians were, and I was going to be down with my people. That was going to be, so I told my father one day that I was going to go to the University of California at San Francisco. And he said, "Not as long as you're my son are you going to go to Harvard." So I ended up going to Harvard, but the fantastic thing was that the year I got there, they started this MD PhD program in anthropology. And I was a human biology concentrator here at Brown. And so because I had already gotten into Harvard Medical School, my father said it was okay to do a PhD in anthropology. So he wasn't a silly man. He knew what he was doing. So one of the things that I've always done is that I've always tackled problems that felt a little bit beyond my comfort zone. And this is the hardest thing to convince people to do. But in just about every situation over the last literally 25 years that I've walked into, there was a knot in my gut and a feeling of, oh my God, we could fail miserably with everything that I took on. And it just, I don't know what that says about me, but it's been like that for a long time. And the great news for all the Brown students is that I want to tell you right now today, you really should do that, because if you're here today and if you graduate from Brown, you are ready to tackle just about anything. I mean, the experience you have here, the diversity of experience, the quality of the education, it has prepared you. So don't be fearful, and know that unless you do that, unless you put yourself into positions that really stretch you, you're really going to be selling yourself short, and you're going to be selling your education here short.
Thank you. Yeah. So let's take questions from the audience. And again, there are 2 microphones, so if people walk down, and we'll alternate back and forth. Why don't we start here on the left? Thank you.
Hi, is this on? Yes.
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon, President Paxson and Dr. Kim. Thank you so much for being here. The things you said in your speech really resonated with me. At the Davos press conference earlier this year, you said, "This is a year to take action on climate change. There are no more excuses. If we fail, our children and grandchildren will ask us why we didn't act when it was still possible to do so. The World Bank Group has decided not to fund coal projects because continuing to do so would betray our responsibility to future generations who will be affected by decisions made today. Coal is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And given the World Bank's stance on the coal industry, what do you think about the Brown Corporation's decision not to divest from the 15 largest coal companies in the United States, saying that the harms caused by the coal industry are not enough for Brown to divest?
Well, I'm at Brown, so I shouldn't be surprised that you asked that question first. And so I want you to understand, though, we have a very nuanced position on coal. Right? And the nuance of the position is simply that 40% of all the energy today still is provided by coal. Washington, Pepco, uses coal to power many of the government buildings. And we have to find a balance. What we said was not that we'd never do coal. We said that we would only do coal in the rarest of circumstances. And what might that be? There are countries that quite literally have no other options. And people have said, well, why not solar and wind-based micro and mini grids? But you have to have baseload. You cannot have intermittent electricity and expect that a country will grow. So our position is nuanced. We're going to try not to do coal because we've set ourselves a target for providing the kind of long-term financing that's necessary for alternative sources of energy. Now, the decisions that the corporation and the President Paxson make about getting in or out of a particular investment, these are hard decisions. And I'll tell you part of the reason why. Some of these investments are long-term investments, and you actually can't get out of them right away. And so I don't know the details of what the portfolio looks like, so I won't comment on that. But here's what I would say. What is the net benefit that Brown University is providing to the entire world around the issue of climate change and the environment? Well, I just met today professors who are studying those very issues here at Brown. I think there's a huge contribution that can be made through academic programs, through research. And there are just an extremely large number of questions that are very complicated. And so what we're trying to do at the World Bank Group is to say, what are those things that everyone agrees on that we can move forward on? So yes, alternative energy, but the fundamental issue is there's no access to long-term capital in poor countries, so we have to do that, and we're doing that. Climate-smart agriculture, there are so many interesting ways that agricultural systems are actually putting carbon back into the ground, and we're not scaling up those solutions, and so we're working aggressively on that. Cleaner cities, I mean, all of these things, cleaner cities, getting rid of fuel subsidies, trying to find a way to have a stable price on carbon, these are the kinds of things that are going to make a huge difference. But having said that, I think it's really great and important that you continue to have this discussion. And my guess is that you'll continue to raise these questions and that the corporation and the president will continue to think about what they want to do next. But my own view is that the net contribution of Brown to fighting climate change is in fact extremely positive, just from what I heard today at lunchtime with the professors.
Thank you. We're just going to do one question per person.
Great.
Good.
Would, Dr. Kim, would you actually accept this gift from me? It's actually a t-shirt.
Great.
Why don't you put it down front? Thank you. So we have a question over here.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you. Great.
My name is Lynn Holmquist. I'm an anthropologist and a sustainability researcher at the Global Shift International University. I do work on sustainability. Now, in 1980, Professor Buckminster Fuller, in his work called Critical Path, explained that the two essential things for integrating world systems was to integrate, first of all, the energy systems, that is the worldwide electrical grid, and secondly, the financial, that is the banking system. And he said the technology, everything to do that was available in 1980. So why did it not happen, and why has not more been done with that in the last 30 years?
Thank you.
I'm going to defer to President Paxson to answer that question. Well, has the global financial system been integrated? Well, one of the things we learned from 2008 is that things that happen here in the United States have a huge impact all over the world. Let me tell you just how it works. We look back at when the U.S. government came close in August of 2011 to not being able to pay its bills. And we didn't actually get there. We had an agreement. But just getting close drove up borrowing costs in developing countries significantly, and that lasted for about 8 months. And so just getting close to not having a budget agreement led to tremendous hardship in developing countries. So it's not even that a problem here translates, but the threat of a problem here translates into increased bond spreads in the developing world. So we're very much linked together. But just take a look at the European system right now. What is the most important problem for them in getting to the next stage of solving their problem? It's a banking union. And everyone agrees that a banking union is necessary, but it's really hard to agree on how you're going to look at assets. Who's going to do this deep dive to figure out what the quality of the assets are? And are the German banks really going to participate? Is everyone going to participate? We know we've got to do it, but it's hard to do. So on the one hand, there's no question that we're connected. At the last G20 finance ministers meeting, the question that was asked was, how is the US thinking about its withdrawal from these unconventional monetary policies? How is it thinking about it? Because every time that every time that the United States reduces their bond buying just a little bit, you see these fluctuations in the developing world. And so, of course, people from the emerging markets were very adamant about the U.S. taking that into consideration. So not only are we connected, but now we have these fora, like the G20 meetings, where literally I see the finance ministers and central bank governors literally 4 or 5 times a year. And so we have these now fora to coordinate, but it's really hard to do it. I mean, we're all waiting to see if the banking union will move forward. It has to. But it's going to be tough because we're talking about nation states.
So there's a secret war between capitalistic perspectives and socialistic perspectives, and the major factor at play is perception of fear.
Thank you for your question. Why don't you blog about that when you leave here? Thank you.
Yeah. Over here.
Dr. Kim.
Yeah.
I come from Myanmar. So firstly, thank you very much for your help towards my home country. So I have a very simple question. Can the World Bank promise to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030, as you have said? And I have an interest in making sure that the World Bank realize that goal, because I want to see millions of people being lifted out of poverty in my home country.
Thank you for that question. We can't guarantee it, but excuse me, it's a little bit loud. But we took a real risk. And it was an interesting process. The World Bank has been around for almost 70 years. And as far as we know, the World Bank has never set a global target like this. Now, but think about it. So this will be the first time in human history that we can actually think about ending extreme poverty in a generation. First time in history. In 1990, close to 50% of the people in the world were living in extreme poverty. So that has now come down very rapidly. We're at about 20%. And we don't think we can ever get it below 3% because of natural disasters. Things happen all the time, hurricanes. People will be moving in and out of poverty in many, many countries in the world. So 3% is our cutoff. That's going to be extremely hard to do. And everyone knows it's going to be extremely hard to do. For example, climate change could throw everything off because if you lose, for example, if we get to 2 degrees Celsius quickly, you're going to lose 40% of the arable land in Africa. And that will lead to food shortages. We're already struggling with water shortages. So it's going to be extremely hard to do. But the reason I pushed so hard for it inside the World Bank Group was because I don't think that people change the way they do things unless there's a clear target with a clear deadline. I've done this multiple times in my life, and every time we've set goals, people have told me that I was crazy. But what I learned was that without clear targets and clear deadlines, people don't self-assess and say, are we fit for purpose to accomplish this end? We're having that conversation right now at the World Bank Group. I don't know. I can't guarantee it, but I can guarantee that we at the World Bank Group will do everything we can, including going through a major organizational change process that we're going through right now, to make ourselves fit for purpose. I can't think of a goal that's more compelling than ending poverty in the world. Now, the reason we have the second goal of boosting shared prosperity is because $1.25 a day is a cutoff for extreme poverty. Now, you'd think that's a really low target, but more than 1 billion people live on less than $1.25 a day. But what we realize is that getting to $1.26 a day is not paradise. So that's why we're also going to focus on inequality and the growth, the income growth of the bottom 40%. It's also the first time in history that the World Bank has set a target and is following an inequality indicator. So I have great hope for Myanmar. I think that the actions of the current leadership were incredibly courageous. I also think that there's huge potential there in Myanmar. So we are with the people of Myanmar. We're on my trip there, we were able to put $2 billion on the table to help them grow. And we are working very intensively to try to realize this dream of ending poverty in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, over here.
Hi, Dr. Kim. Firstly, I'm Leah. I'm studying design and international development, and I wanted to say thank you for making the Korean American community proud, and for being such a great rapper as well. Still have not forgotten about that. I just have a question about how do you think your background in social medicine and anthropology will contribute to making or changing the general approach of development to more human-centered, bottom-up approach? Because former presidents have been from the banking background and economist background, so I wanted to see what you thought of that.
Well, I think the thing that has been most striking to me, and I hope also striking to people inside the World Bank Group, is that I've been doing development for most of my adult life. So many of the former presidents of the World Bank Group had to spend a lot of time going to the field to understand what it's like to try to make something happen in a poor country. I've been doing it all my life. So because I had a kind of innate understanding of what they were doing, I was able to devote a lot of my time in the first year and a half to organizational change. The organization hadn't changed since 1997. And budgeting processes and everything was very antiquated. So it's really one of the most extraordinary institutions I've ever been a part of, incredibly bright people. But the most exciting part of it is that we have some 3,000 or 4,000 PhDs, most of them economists. But they haven't just been sitting in cubicles reading studies or crunching data. They've been out in the field trying to get roads built, bridges, building healthcare systems. And so we have a collection of practitioners that are just really quite unique in the world. And so what we're trying to do right now is to bring them together so that they can use their information in very practical ways. Coming from the medical field, we're constantly looking at the latest data, but we're constantly looking at the latest data so we can improve the way we treat patients. And so the bank is full of sort of clinicians, right? The economists are the closest thing to sort of economic clinicians I've ever met, because what they're doing is looking at the data to try to help countries actually change their reality. And so just breaking down barriers so that they'll talk to each other and bring the solutions everywhere more quickly and more effectively, I hope has a big impact. And not sure if my medical or anthropology background has an effect, but I tell you, the method of anthropology is ethnography. And basically it's studying different tribes and trying to figure out what the hell's going on. And so my medical training comes comes in use occasionally, but my ethnographic skills I use every single day.
Thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Kim, thank you for being here. My name is David, and I recently transferred to Brown this past year too. So I appreciate you sharing your stories about that and your experience. Could you tell us what a difficult time you had at Brown and how you went about over resolving that issue? And secondly, tell us about a crazy or funny story about your Brown times. You got
So probably my most difficult time at Brown was in the semester in which I took Introduction to Organic Chemistry. I realized I had like a B minus going into the final. And I thought, thoughts, as always, when I'm getting a B minus, turn to my father. Right? And I remember studying literally 20 hours a day for 10 days, because I knew that to get an A, I had to get the highest grade in the class. So I didn't get the highest grade in the class, but I got one of the highest grades in the class, and I got an A. And I thought that that would cure me forever of procrastination, but it didn't. But that was a hard time. And a funny, crazy time. Well, there was just so many, and it's not a funny, so much as that my time in the Third World Center really did shape me in so many ways. And I just remember so many evenings sitting late into the night in the Third World Center. Back in those days, it wasn't this beautiful house like we have now. We were in the basement of Churchill House, right? And at the time, it was called Rights and Reasons. It was an African-American theater group. And so many evenings where we would just be talking about things, and you would hear, a group of Puerto Rican students talking about what it was like to grow up as Puerto Ricans in New York City. One of our friends was from Eagle Rock, Texas, and he would talk about what it was like to grow up as a child of migrant workers in southern Texas. And then folks who were, at that time, Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York was the toughest neighborhood of any neighborhood. And we had a lot of people from Bed-Stuy who would come and just tell us what it was like. And so there were moments of great hilarity because we shared this experience at that time of being committed to exploring who we were at that time as people of color. Right? But the funny thing is that those conversations have never left my mind. I still have vivid memories of those conversations, and I try to remember them when I go out and do things in the world.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Kim. My name is Miriam. I'm a European. And yeah, when I tell people my country, most people are like, what? That's the capital of what? Never mind.
Which country?
Norway.
Ah.
Which you'd be surprised at how many brown students think that's the capital of Sweden. At least
Norway is the most generous country in the world in terms of foreign assistance. Thank you.
I'd like to take credit for that, but at least if I say I'm European, at least most Americans have an understanding of where that's like a continent. No, my point is, I, like everyone else here who's a student, I guess, I've grown up after the Cold War in Europe, that's been surprisingly peaceful and calm, and now, over the past few weeks, suddenly we've seen something like an implosion in Southeastern Europe. And, I can barely, whenever I check the news, something new has come up, the EU has now offered a crisis package to Ukraine, and Putin has offered a crisis package to Ukraine, and they're like overbidding each other, and Crimea might be leave. And I'm wondering, what is your perspective from sort of the World Bank Group on the crisis in Crimea, in Ukraine, and on sort of also what the wider world and international scene can do to dissolve the tension?
Yeah. Well, I've become very good friends with the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. We travel a lot together now, and it's great because actually I had forgotten every word of Korean before when I was at Brown, and I was so excited to meet Korean students here that I did a PhD in Korean. I learned to speak Korean, so now Secretary General and I can speak to each other in Korean, and no one knows what we're talking about. and his mandate is politics. And my mandate is economic development. So we're actually limited by our Constitution from getting into political matters. I'm going to answer your question. But I have never seen anybody who has more endurance and ability to tackle intractable, difficult problems as the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. So I'm very glad that he has his job, right? Because my job is a little bit easier in the sense that what our role in Ukraine is we have about $1.5 or $1.6 billion of investments in Ukraine right now on everything from health and education to helping them improve their business environment. We do a lot of things in the Ukraine. And right now, we're basically waiting to see where the political discussions will go. In terms of the projects that we have ongoing, we continue. But we will have a role when global powers, the Ukrainian government, these discussions, when we decide who's going to be taking the lead, who's going to be, what the country's going to look like, how the powers are going to sort themselves out, we will be ready to increase our assistance to the Ukraine for matters around development. Now, of course, politics has a part in all of these different discussions, but we actually don't participate in negotiations about political agreements. We stand ready to support when those political agreements have been resolved. So we stand ready. Again, my job is just incredibly, I feel incredibly fortunate to have my job, because just over the last 2 weeks, I met with both the Prime Minister of Moldova and the Prime Minister of Georgia. They all came to Washington, and I got to sit and talk with them. And of course, they have very deep worries about the current instability. My hope is that everyone will realize that the stakes for not being able to reach a peaceful agreement are just far too high to back off from those efforts. And so, what we say is, please, please, everybody, calm down. Let's find a path forward. And what I can tell you is that the motivation to find a path forward is extremely high everywhere. So I remain optimistic that something good will happen.
Good, thank you. Yes.
Dr. Kim, thank you so much for coming here. You do a great honor to the university and what you do in your job as head of the World Bank Group and what you've done since your graduation from Brown. And I ask this question of you particularly because of your background, that unlike the previous leaders of the World Bank Group, you have expertise in health and particularly in tackling a problem, HIV, that plagues so many of the areas that are in extreme poverty. And my question is, how do you deal with or reconcile with these sort of systemic, largely ideological factors that exist in areas of extreme poverty, or even the poverty we see in the United States, that work against or prevent or rebel against these sort of pragmatic solutions that are necessary to counteract problems like HIV, when we see religious opposition to the distribution of birth control, or in the United States, for example, when we see something like that and we see how that spreads teen pregnancy, which keeps communities in poverty. And so I suppose my question is, how do we work against, or at least reconcile with these existing ideologies and religious beliefs about pragmatic solutions that may exist in order to arrive at the goals of ending extreme poverty?
That's a great question, and I would just say this. One of the great benefits of coming from the medical field is that something happened in medicine probably now 30, 35 years ago, and it was the evidence-based revolution in medicine. I mean, people think that for 100 years, the medicine was only doing what was evidence-based, and that was not the case at all. This sort of devotion to generating data on what works, what doesn't work, what works in what situation, it's really only about 30, 35 years old. So having been trained in that tradition, my approach is to always say, well, okay, what's the evidence base that these kinds of ideologies make any sense? And so, for example, let's take gender equality. Right? There are a lot of countries where leaderships doesn't necessarily believe in the same things that we believe in terms of access to education, access to jobs, et cetera. And so all we can do is continue to provide evidence that to limit access of women to education, limit the access of especially girls to education, limiting the access of women to the job market is actually a really bad economic choice. So, for example, at Davos this year, Prime Minister Abe came and he basically said, our biggest problem is that women don't participate in the workforce at the level that they should. And that if they increased the participation of women in the workforce, they could increase their GDP by up to 14%. Right? Now, a 14% increase in GDP growth is an enormous change. Now, they're going to have to go through a lot of pretty fundamental social changes to get there, but my own sense is that these things can happen pretty quickly. So what we do is to try to make the case that there's so much evidence now that discrimination is actually bad economics. There's so much evidence now that investing in people, in their education, in their health, in social protection is actually good economics. Now, we didn't really have that data 30, 40 years ago, right? And President Paxson did a lot of the research to show us how important investment in children, for example, was for economic growth. But we have it now. So the great thing for me as president of the World Bank Group is it feels like the evidence base and the moral and ethical arguments have now come together in a powerful way, right? So, you know, we're talking about sovereign countries, and they can have their own views about women, about sexual minorities, the LGBT community. They can have their views on it, but it's our job to continue to move forward and put evidence in front of people that say discrimination is bad for your economy. Discrimination is not going to allow you to lift your people out of poverty, and here's the data.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Dr. Kim, first of all, thank you so much for coming to take the time to talk to us today. The points in your speech were phenomenal, so thank you for enlightening us. My name is Cliff. I lead a startup company. I'm also doing an independent concentration here in renewable energy, particularly focusing on photovoltaic engineering. From that perspective, I have kind of a naive question, which is anytime when you're a student and you're leading a project or a company, having validation from someone like you, who's well-known and has a lot of prestige, is really advantageous, and having the ability to work through your connections would be phenomenal. Do you have... No, this is not a question for me personally, this is for any student. Do you have any recommendations on how to contact people in your position, and how to get to know people like you, and be able to have communication with them, for all students in general? That's the first question.
Yeah.
The second question is also a social one, which is how do you lead, manage, and inspire people that work with you?
So the first question, come down here and get a card from my team right here. Come on down.
That part worked.
Okay. And so what I would say is, look, we need better technology around the photovoltaic cells that you're talking about. As you know, we're a lot better with concentrated solar, right? But are we going to be at the point where, say, you build a solar farm in Morocco and are able to transmit that to France? Right? It's a project we're working on right now, right? And you would think that we would put everything we had into trying to build better solar capacity, better concentrated solar capacity, so it could actually provide baseload. You know exactly what I'm talking about. So that's what we need to do, but we're underinvesting in that enormously. So if you got game, we will get you in touch with the people you need to talk to, all right? Now, in terms of inspiring, the thing is,
Wait, just to clarify that question, the main question was how do so that was effective for me, but the question is actually, the question is actually for everybody else,
Yeah.
which is, if I do get your email, however, there's ways to get everybody's email. What are you looking for in an email from a student in order to start engaging with them?
The first thing is that you really know what you're doing. You have, let me then go back and link it to the next question, right? So what do I do in thinking about leadership? So I think about it all the time. I've thought about it for most of my adult life. I played quarterback on my football team, but we lost every single game when I was a senior. So starting from that leadership failure, right, I have been obsessed with leadership because what I understood from years of knocking my head up against, building healthcare systems is that, how you organize a group of people is the most important thing in getting you where you want to get. There's very few things that are really transformational that you can do on your own. So I think about it all the time, right? And I have a leadership coach. I'm a charity case for him because he's the leadership coach for Alan Mullally, the CEO of Ford. He's a leadership coach for Ian Reed, the CEO of Pfizer. He's the sort of, but I met him and he's been helping me. And here's why I do that. If any of you want a perspective on this, read Atul Gawande's piece in the New Yorker on coaching, right? And he said something very simple. He said, Tiger Woods has a coach. Why don't I have a coach as a surgeon? And so he got someone to coach him in the OR in his second decade of doing surgery, and he got better, right? Now, I've known this for a long time, and so for me, that you always can get better as a leader. But the most important thing is you have to say, I can get better as a leader. And I've been thinking and thinking and thinking about this, but here's then how it relates. So the most important thing you can do as a leader is pick the right people. And what do we look for in people? Fred Hassan, one of the greatest CEOs in the healthcare business, came and spent a whole day with me at the World Bank Group because he's just such a great leader. And he came and he said, look, Jim, talking, inspiring people, all that's fine, but it's your team. Your team is everything, and you've got to work with them. And he said, there's only 3 things I look for when I hire somebody, which is just what I look for when somebody comes to approach me. 1, are they technically excellent? Right? And this is important. You actually can improve people's technical excellence. The second is, do they have fire in the belly? And that's just how he said it. Do they have fire in the belly? And the third is, are they trustworthy? Are they team players? Can you trust them? So it's become very simple. I'd never seen it put that simply before, but now everyone in the bank knows that that's what we're doing. Right? And that the thing that is non-negotiable is the trustworthiness part. Right? I've made it clear that we're going to work together as a team. We're going to help each other. We're going to be respectful. And we have, if you can't get excited about ending poverty in the world, man, what can you get excited about? But what I also know is that you have to manage people. You have to constantly inspire them. And the best way to do that is to pick a great team. So if you know what you're doing, clearly you have fire in your belly, right? And if we can trust you to keep going and make this work, then we'll get you to the right people.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. I've really appreciated your talk thus far. I have a question sort of going back a little bit to climate change, but then a broader question after that. So regarding climate change, and you have priorities all across the world in how to implement initiatives to deal with that issue. How do you deal specifically perhaps with the issue of some countries being more capable of moving from fossil fuels away, or moving away from fossil fuels, but other countries, for example, like India or China, still having a lot of power issues where they might be better off potentially using fossil fuels as their first energy source when they have a lot of power issues. So I guess one is, my first question is about feasibility, and then the second part is on climate change, but also a lot of issues in general. How do you go about implementing these concrete goals that you have when you're dealing with fragile and volatile political institutions?
Well, those are very good and complicated questions, and let me just try to take them one at a time. So, I think if given the choice, people would rather have clean energy than, they'd rather have a green economy than a brown economy. But there's just no question that fossil fuels are going to be a big part of our future going forward. And for me, the question really is, if we want to go to a green economy, what are the things that are holding us back? And what can the World Bank do to remove those obstacles? Right? So one of the big ones is long-term finance. In order to build a solar farm in Morocco with transmission lines all through Europe, that takes a lot of upfront investment. And it's not clear what kind of return there will be. So it's very hard to get the private sector engaged. But if we in the World Bank set up a system where even pension funds and sovereign wealth funds can see that over time they can actually get a good return, then we can actually bring together the financing to support these sort of difficult but important transformative projects. So finance is one of the things that we need to do. But the other thing is that there's lots of really great examples of, for example, climate-smart agriculture. Costa Rica is doing some great stuff. There's a great project in Kenya, the Loess Valley in China. They're great examples of people who've done things that increase the productivity of the farmers, while at the same time putting carbon into the ground and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's just that those things aren't spreading. So we're trying to be the great sort of interlocutors who help spread good ideas quickly. We can provide a little bit of finance, but probably our biggest role is going to be in helping people who want to do these innovative good things to take them through not just the first step of the idea, but take them through all the way to completion. And that means that we have to bring all of our brilliant economists with practical experience. We have to get them working together to actually support people in not just telling them what they should do, but helping them by providing the how of how to take the next step and the next step. You know, fragile and conflict-affected states are extremely difficult. We've committed to increasing our work in fragile and conflict-affected states by 50%. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be really, really hard. One of the ways we're trying to do this is we're trying to link security, peace, and development. So the Secretary General of the United Nations and I, about a year ago, went to the Great Lakes region of Africa. We went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we went to Rwanda and Uganda. And the World Bank put on the table $1 billion. And the Secretary General helped to sign peace agreements. And the idea was that as long as you respect the peace agreements, we're going to continue to invest in the whole region to try to bring development. Now, what was interesting is that as we were landing, the Secretary General looked at me and said, you know, this is, as far as we can tell, the first time in history that the Secretary General of the United Nations and the World Bank President ever traveled on mission together. Right? Now, 70 years ago, the intention was that we would do it all the time. But what happens is that because of personalities or just the inertia of huge bureaucracies, these things were not happening before. So what we're trying to do in fragile and conflict-affected states is go in with the UN, go in with the African Union, go in with the European Union. The next trip we took was to the Sahel, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. And at that trip, we actually brought the European Union with us, and the African Union, and the African Development Bank. And I think that if we bring these issues together, peace and security and development, we might have a chance to make progress that we didn't have before.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Kim, you've been very eloquent about what the consequences will be if we don't do something to arrest the rapid direction towards global warming and climate change. I think a lot of people would like to do something, have good intentions, but we all know where the road paved with good intentions will lead us. What are 3 practical things, or even one practical thing, that each of us could do to try to stop the race towards global warming?
Yeah. Well, you know, when I came into the job, I met with a lot of the great leaders who are tackling climate change. One of the first meetings I had was with Vice President Gore. And then I met with Professor Pachauri, who runs the scientists group. And I met with Fred Krupp of the Environmental Defense Fund and Carter Roberts, the World Wildlife Fund. They've all become friends. And I think that the history of responding to climate change has been about what individuals can do. And so I think they have lots of good ideas. You know, solar panels on your home, be careful about how you use water, and maybe more important than anything else is just inform yourself about the science of climate change. I think that what we've been missing is the kind of massive global action that we need to take to tackle things like fuel subsidies. So for example, in Egypt, one of the biggest problems in Egypt is that they spend a huge proportion of their GDP on subsidies. They have very inexpensive gas, but they should get rid of their fuel subsidies because they're now facing such difficult economic times that they need that money that they're putting into fuel subsidies to pay for all the other things that the government needs to do. But it's really hard to do. Now, one of the really great things that's been happening over the last few years, last couple of years under Christine Lagarde of the IMF, is that Christine's really been speaking out on climate change and on fuel subsidies. And so to have the IMF start thinking about what they can do to support countries to get out of the fuel subsidy business, I think it's really, I mean, their latest data is that we spend $1.9 trillion a year on subsidies. Right? So what could we do with that money if we didn't spend it on fuel subsidies? So I think that there are plenty of things that individuals can do, and that's great. But the most important thing is to inform yourselves. And in places like Brown, I think it's great that the students are trying to push the issue. There are all kinds of things that every institution can do to play its part. You know, the Chinese, I have never seen a country and a government more committed to reducing its carbon footprint than these guys. These guys are, I mean, they're building coal plants because they have to have energy, but my goodness, their aspirations for reducing their carbon footprint are really high. And so if China, the United States, the European Union can come to some agreement, we could make huge amounts of progress.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Kim. It's an honor to have you here. Thanks so much for speaking. So I wanted to ask you about the World Bank's position on water privatization, because I know the World Bank really supports water privatization efforts, and I believe maintains a policy of having the initiation of water privatization efforts as a precondition for development loans. And I know that there's a number of merits from water privatization, including that it accelerates the development of infrastructure with the profit motive. But I think the case studies of Brazil and India also show that there's a lot of opportunity for price gouging, and the water quality severely deteriorated, and there were mass riots, as I'm sure you know. So I was wondering if the World Bank is taking any steps to mitigate those negative effects of water privatization.
Yeah, well, 20 years ago, I graduated from about 1982, and then I really never visited Washington, D.C. Until the early 1990s. And I went to Washington, D.C. for the first time in the early 1990s to participate in demonstrations against the World Bank. At the time, the World Bank was coming on its 50th anniversary, and so I was part of a movement called 50 Years is Enough. And the very thing we objected to was what we thought was an ideological approach to specific issues. Right? The privatization of not only water, but health care. There was a almost religious belief in user fees for even the poorest countries to get access to healthcare services. And what's happened is that over time, one of the things that I love about the World Bank, and one of the reasons why I'm glad we weren't successful in closing down the World Bank, is that this is an institution that has changed as evidence has grown. Right? And so that has been the commitment for quite some time. But I can tell you that under my leadership, the commitment to forcing evidence to change our policies and to be non-ideological about the recommendations we make is as important as anything I do. Right? So has there been a bad history with certain projects? Certainly. But again, what we're doing now is that when we make a mistake, we're going to admit it. I mean, there are more safeguards. In fact, the whole safeguards around development was invented at the World Bank Group. We have an inspection panel. Any group of people who feel wronged in any way can come and file a complaint, and then an independent body that reports only to the board of the World Bank Group, which is made up of 188 member countries, can investigate whether or not we've violated our own rules. So, water is a really, really tough, tricky issue. And what I can tell you is this. We are looking very carefully at past experiences. We are not going to go forward on the basis of ideology saying privatization of everything is good. Do we support privatization in many instances? Absolutely. Because what we find is that governments in many countries cannot possibly run these utilities or other systems and actually make it work. But what we also do is we continue to follow up with projects. Right? And we continue to monitor them to make sure that they're actually delivering. And that's one of the things that's most important. It happens in so many areas. For example, in Africa, there's an explosion of discovery of minerals, of oil, gas, precious metals, everything. And one of the things we found is that the agreements that are being made between private companies and governments are not very favorable to the governments. So we did something really simple. We just, the French started a fund for us, and we just pay for very good lawyers from developed world to actually work with the African countries to make sure that the deals at least just look like the deals in all the other parts of the world. Right? So on the one hand, my job is to help economies grow. Listen to that statistic that I provided earlier. 90% of all jobs in the developing world are created by the private sector. There is not a country in the world that doesn't need to have a growing private sector. On the other hand, we also work with governments so that they can put the rules in place to, on the one hand, make sure that these companies are growing, but on the other, protecting against all the negative effects that you mentioned. That's our job. It's really hard. It's really hard to get it right, and we're going to make mistakes all the time. But one of the things that I've made very clear to my whole team is that the minute we find that we're making a mistake and that we're not going down the right path, we're going to admit it for all the world to see, and we're going to get on and fix it. Right.
Thank you. 5 minutes? Okay. Yes.
Hi. Thank you again for coming. I study, and you kind of answered part of my question with that answer, but I study development here, and I know that there's been a push in like recent years to move away from top-down development, but also top-down privatization. And I'm wondering if the World Bank has seen like increased efforts to identify like more grassroots efforts and kind of identify and engage with those in a more substantive manner.
Yeah. So for the first time in history, last year, year and a half ago, we started something called the Global Program on Social Accountability. So for the first time, the World Bank is providing money directly to civil society organizations and other foundations. And the very explicit purpose is to get more beneficiary feedback. In other words, how are our projects impacting the people in the actual communities? So, top down, bottom up, depends on what you mean by that, right? So one of the things that happened 20 years ago is that we irrevocably put the countries in the driver's seat. In other words, it's the governments that are, through negotiations, are going to decide the projects that we work on, not us at the World Bank Group. And it wasn't always like that. That's why we were on the streets protesting, because there seemed to be a kind of a one-size solution fits all, and it was called structural adjustment. Now, turns out structural adjustment was really important because it focused on getting the macroeconomics right, and it really had an impact, a positive impact on these countries. But there were blind spots, and so we're now trying to fill in blind spots and get better at doing it. So the most important thing that I'll tell you is we try very, very hard not to be ideological now. And not being ideological means that we listen to the people from the communities. We listen to what they want, what they don't want. We work very closely with governments. Governments are in the driver's seat. Our responsibility, though, is that the governments might come to us and say, we want to improve health, right? But they may not necessarily have a person who's got a 50-step plan for how to improve the healthcare system. What we do is come in and say, okay, here's what we know about your mortality and morbidity statistics. Here's what we know about your current system. And we think that there are 50 countries out there in the world who've done things that you could benefit from. Here's a menu of possible solutions that you can bring to your country, and we will work with you to try it out and see which ones will work best. When you have a fundamental mission of ending poverty, that's what you have to focus on. And so we don't have a commitment to a particular ideology or a particular way of doing things. We have a commitment to ending poverty, and that forces us not to be ideological.
Thank you. We have time for maybe 2 more questions, and what I thought was maybe we could take questions from several questions at once, and you can maybe weave them together in a final answer. So what was your question?
Hi, so I'm a chemistry concentrator. I'm actually one of the few people who enjoy organic chemistry. Yeah, so.
I did too, after those 10 days.
Gotcha. But yeah, so I can see myself, going to grad school, doing research, like, being stuck in a lab, doing pure chemistry stuff. But on the other hand, I'm also very interested and want to be engaged in, social justice and changing the world. Not necessarily in my field, but like in a bigger sense. So I guess my question is, what do you see is the role, or what do you think, like people in academia, or like not even necessarily academia, but people who don't have jobs, so to say,
nerds, basically, right?
Yeah.
What's the role of nerds in social justice?
Yeah, or just like people who aren't, like in the political world, or who are not directly involved with, changing policies.
Well, that's a great question. Look, I'm a nerd. I've been a nerd all my life, and I think nerds have a huge role to play in social justice. And so, where's the gentleman that launched his company? Right there. What's your name again?
Class, I think.
Cliff. Meet a nerd in chemistry who can help you make those photovoltaic cells, right? That might change the world, right? So, do we need more chemists in the world? Oh my God, of course we do, right? Do we need chemists who will think as they do their work about how to make the world a better place? Oh, of course we do, right? So the question you have to ask yourself is, do you love chemistry? And if you love chemistry, you happen to be one of the incredibly rare people on Earth who have a chance to study chemistry at Brown University, right? And I think that puts as much responsibility on you as anyone who studies political science or anything else. You have a responsibility to be so good at what you do that the things you discover and the things that you make will change the world for the better. Because right now, the deficit we have in the world is only partly social movements. We need social movements, but we also need better chemistry. So if you love chemistry, man, do it. And just never lose sight of the fact that through chemistry, you can change the world.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So unfortunately, we have time for one final question. So this belongs to you. I hope it's a good one.
Hi, my name is Sujay, and I really enjoyed your talk, so thank you so much for that. I would just like to ask this question where, in politics class as well, we always learn about the World Bank and the history of the World Bank, and there's always been criticism of the World Bank and the structural policies that you have towards the developing countries. So what are your views on that? What do you think personally you can do or you will be doing in the years to come to change the view about the World Bank that we have of you?
Yeah, I've talked a lot about that, but you're right. The view is still hasn't changed, right? And in many parts of the world, the countries view the World Bank as a very negative force. And so there's a lot of work that we're trying to do. So one of the things we're trying to do is, unlike we've ever done before, we're trying to lead a movement to end poverty, because I think it will require movement. We're trying to help build a movement to fight climate change. Now, the World Bank has never been known as the institution that builds movements. But in so many ways, we have the opportunity to do it and make it happen in a way that very few other organizations can, because we have tons of knowledge and we also have money. And there are not a lot of organizations that have that combination. So I would just say, think about your question again in like a year or 2 years. And what I hope that you will see is that people will associate the World Bank with the movement to end poverty. I had the great good fortune of meeting Pope Francis. And he's from Argentina. And we spoke in Spanish. And I told him about how I'd spent my whole life trying to work on the principle of making a preferential option for the poor. And that comes from Catholic social teaching. And he said to me, that's exactly what I believe. Right? And then at the end of it, I said, we need to start a movement to end poverty. And he just said to me, cuenta conmigo, count on me. Now, if the World Bank and the Pope can work together to build a movement to end poverty, every single student here at Brown should do something to make it happen. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Kim.